Good evening, all. My name is Barry O'Loughlin, and I'll be the chairman tonight, along with Dr. Lloyd Toft, my co-chairman. It's a great pleasure. I'm very fond of the Royal Brisbane and aware of its rich and colourful history, so it's a great honour for me to be the chair tonight. This is the Discovering RBWH History Series, Part 9, Myths and Legends. We have a few people in the audience. I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Rob Stable, Chairman of the Metro North HHS. I think also Dr. David Rosengren, the Chief Executive of RBWH. And I'd also like to acknowledge Cliff Pollard, who's the chair of the RBWH Alumni Association and his group, particularly Amy Henderson for all the great work she's done in organising this evening tonight. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, and I'd like to welcome you all here tonight to hear about some of the myths and legends of the hospital. Now, our first speaker is Jeanette Wiley. Jeanette has a nursing background, did her nursing training here at, I suppose, the Brisbane General Hospital from 1956 to 1960. She worked in paediatrics and in palliative care, both here in Brisbane and throughout the world. Jeanette's also got a very close association with the Museum of Nursing, and she was Vice President of the Royal Brisbane Hospital Nurses Association and Secretary of Dying with Dignity Queensland. Jeanette's a dyed-in-the-wool Brisbane General, Royal Brisbane Hospital, Royal Brisbane Hospital and Women's Hospital alumnus. More recently, Jeanette's co-authored a book entitled The Brisbane Hospital and the Great War, based on the storyboards she and Clooney Seeger and Cliff Pollard created in 2014. This display was officially opened by the Governor-General, Sir Peter Cosgrove, and the book was dedicated to those who served. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Jeanette Wiley.
Thanks, Daz. Hi, and thank you so much for coming. When we were planning the history program for this year, one of the alumni committee suggested that we do one session just for fun. After all the wonderful, deep and meaningful talks by so many learned historians. So I think I was the obvious choice, not being as learned as my colleagues. I pondered over the title, what is a myth and what is a legend? My conclusion is that a myth is a story and a legend is someone or something that has stamped time at the Royal in such a way as to be legendary. So I hope you agree with that definition. So let's go back to the very beginning of the Brisbane Hospital on the Hurston site. When I started my nursing in 1956, the tower block was still in use. It had been built in 1866 when a select committee interviewed Charles Tiffin, who was a colonial architect. The new Brisbane Hospital was to be surrounded by verandas and balconies which added large covered spaces for patients with lots of fresh air. The doors and windows on the verandas were to be kept open as much as possible. The new hospital building had 2 stories and a central tower, so it became known as the tower block. There were 4 large wards, 2 on the ground floor and 2 on the upper floor. Each ward was 60 by 24 by 14 foot high and would house 20 patients. A few smaller wards would take a total of 20 more patients. There was a kitchen wing for the wardies and lodgings for male and female nurses. Water from the roof would be caught in a large tank capable of holding 164,000 litres. It's a wonder the roof didn't fall in. Hot and cold water would be supplied to the wards. There was a mortuary, which they called the dead house. The drainage from the hospital emptied into Breakfast Creek. The builder was John Petrie, who was the Mayor of Brisbane 3 times and Chairman of the Brisbane Hospital Committee for 10 years. The Nurses' Museum is custodian of this precious piece of memorabilia. It was found in the tower in 1967, 101 years later, on a shelf behind a stored records by Kevin Buckley, and it reads, 2nd of October, 1866. Walter Wilson and Adam Walker, lining these beams, hereby record this hospital was built in the year of our Lord, 1866. Sir George Bowen, 1st Governor of Queensland. John Petrie, contractor, a man respected by all. D. McNaught, foreman, also a worthy man. Signed, Adam Walker. When I was in my final year of nursing, I saved an empty Mathias Rosé bottle and put a candle in it and had it in my room. Thought I was very grown up. After a room inspection, the matron the home sister sent me to matron to explain why I had alcohol in my room. So I thought we'd have a look at the history of alcohol at the Royal. The first house surgeon, John Lansdowne, resigned in 1868, and Joseph Bancroft was elected to the post. Unfortunately, he was seen to block his copybook. The first matron was a Miss Barker. She had as one of her duties control over the hospital stores, including the medicinal wines and brandy. She resigned, stating she needed more staff. Miss Murray took her place and obviously still had control over the stores because she was dismissed in April of 1868 for allegedly diluting the hospital brandy. Dr. Bancroft resented the power given to the matrons, so the next one, Mrs. Tannock, fell out with him only months into her term, stating that she refused to consider herself subordinate to his authority. The dispute festered on and on until Dr. B reported to the committee that matrons, quote, overseeing of the nurses and servants is as defective as possible, and that she refused to consider herself subordinate to his authority as house surgeon. After months of wrangling, he then accused her of malappropriating the hospital stores, but there was no mention of alcohol with this one. The committee supported Mrs. Tannock. Dr. Bancroft remained, but one surmises that tensions existed. In 1872, it was reported in a letter to the Courier Mail that the hospital, that's John Bancroft. It was reported in the Courier Mail that the hospital committee had spent £203 on spirits and wine and £206 on bread. Now, in 1871, it was reported they just did a little bit better than the year before, when it was $100 more spent on alcohol than there was spent on bread. In 1871, it was reported that wardsmen were frequently seen drunk and troublesome. In 1877, Dr. Thompson, who was a head surgeon, reported that matron had been intoxicated and unfit for duty. She took the pledge of total abstinence, but a few weeks later was again intoxicated and unfit for duty, so she was dismissed. But worse was yet to come. In 1878, Dr. Kevin O'Doherty was called to see a patient who needed an amputation of a leg shattered by a gunshot. Dr. Thompson, a house surgeon, and Dr. Mullen, a visiting surgeon, thought that O'Doherty was not fit in a fit state to operate. Doherty indignantly repelled such an accusation and called for another staff member to decide. The patient died 2 days later, and in court, the chief warder said that Doherty was certainly the worst for drink, that the patient said he didn't want her Doherty due to his intoxicated condition. The hospital committee, despite these internal alcohol problems, called on the Liquor Licensing Board, in the interests of the Brisbane Hospital, to expose the granting of a liquor licence to the Bowen Bridge Hotel, which was close to the hospital. The call was unsuccessful. Unfortunately, the tower block was demolished on the 21st of February 1969. One of our nursing legends, Elizabeth Ann Stewart Abell, was matron at that time. She had long admired the beautiful stones and wrote in her diary, "The old tower block is almost down, making way for the new hospital." The number of large stones included one from the top of the tower. It's about 4 feet across, round, flat like an old grinding stone. I'll rescue it and put it near the nurses' swimming pool and mark where it came from. It lay for nearly 40 years near Lady Lamington Nurses' Home. In 2016, the stone appeared to be in peril as it lay in the Hurston Quarter redevelopment zone. The Nurses Association Heritage Trail team advocated for it to be relocated. Naja Martinek contacted Miss Abell and obtained a statement of significance to support the providence of the stone. And the Hurston Quarter project team advised that the stone had been included in the heritage audit and arranged for it to be relocated in the garden on Central Drive. One of the saddest aspects of our campus is the history that has been destroyed. And the only positive is the ghosts who have been set free. So in 1957, I find myself ensconced in the nurses' quarters, listening to the many stories told by the senior nurses. I didn't work in the tower block, but one of the stories I was told from a nurse who had been on night duty there got me thinking. She'd been sitting at the desk in the middle of the night ward, writing reports by the light over which we always put a blue cloth, when she saw a registered nurse by the bedside of a patient in the very far corner of the ward. She walked to the bed, but the sister had vanished. However, the patient's condition had suddenly deteriorated. She certainly wouldn't have noticed until her next round if the phantom RN hadn't guided her. My next ghost still resides on campus. Alice Adelaide Abell graduated in 1919, was matron of the Children's Hospital from 1928 to 1951 and the Brisbane General Hospital from 1952 to 1958. She seemed a remote and austere figure to us student nurses and most of the trained staff. She was rarely seen in the wards and only occasionally glimpsed in the hospital rounds, as accompanied only by her umbrella, she strode between her quarters in the Edith Cavell building and her office in the tower block. However, nurses who had actually worked with her at the Children's said she was kind, patient and pleasant to the junior staff. It seems she may have been happy at both the Children's Hospital and Edith Cavell buildings, because I have it on good authority that she resides in both these buildings. Matron Billing was vitally interested in recent developments in nursing in other places, so during her first few months as matron, she travelled widely to assess nursing conditions throughout Australia. She reported on her return that she was most impressed by the postgraduate courses at the College of Nursing in Melbourne and strongly recommended that our trained nurses be encouraged to attend. Her report on nursing training in other parts of Australia revealed the Brisbane Hospital was falling further and further behind. Those dreadful broken shifts that we were forced to work had been eliminated in most of the other large metropolitan general hospitals, with more staff being taken on to allow for rostered of straight 8-hour shifts. The board agreed to some of her recommendations and agreed for a trial of straight 8-hour shifts. And I'm sure the sigh of relief from us was heard all over Brisbane. However, they would not agree that the criteria for entry to nursing should be lifted from scholarship to a junior certificate. This suggested that they were still prepared to accept a low education requirement as the nurses of attracting staff instead of improving the reality of nurse education, the level of wages and conditions, and thus attract girls with a higher standard of education. Matron Billing must have loved her time at the Children's, as she seems unable to leave. The first account of her is written by Susan Pillow and Sandra Watson in 1984. They wrote, "It was a sunny day at the Royal Brisbane Hospital Nurses' Quarters, and Nurse Pillow and Nurse Watson were having a picnic in the shade. They decided to go to the sunken garden, which used to be between the nurses' quarters and Lady Lamington. We felt a sudden chill, even though it was a hot day. As we approached the garden down the stony path, we saw a movement by a tree. When we looked around the tree, there was nothing there, but we heard footsteps and a door slammed. We opened the door and went inside, leaving the door open. The passage inside was silent. Suddenly the door slammed shut. Behind us, a stone flew past us, shattering a mirror. There had been reports of a ghost of Adelaide Billing coming back to haunt the hospital, so we were terrified. In a dark room with nowhere to hide, the door opened, revealing a figure dressed in white. They wrote, was it a ghost or just our imagination? But no, it wasn't our imagination, it really was a ghost. We just froze, not knowing what to do. Should we just stay there or should we run away? We ran past the ghost and out into the sunshine. We made it, but we were still scared. Some nurses have a special love for children and a real gift for nursing them, and this seems to apply to Adelaide. According to the testimony of a male nurse in 1985, he wrote, Miss Billing is still, years after her death, looking after sick children. One night he was looking after a child who was receiving IV fluids, and a small burette had to be filled half-hourly. He went to check it, but found the sister doing it for him. He didn't recognise her, but thanked her and returned to the desk. The night superintendent couldn't tell him who she was, and it was not until he saw her portrait that he realised who the Good Samaritan had been. I've been told by security many times, quite recently, that they have also seen her. One asked me one day if any RNs still wore white uniforms and veils, because one had passed him on the stairs going from Mackonnell to Raff. Adelaide had an odd taste in makeup. She wore very pale face powder and very bright red lipstick. Yes, he said, when I described her. The security guys tell me that this has happened quite frequently. In 1985, Mary Cogut had her story published in the Queensland Nurse. It reads, "For a nurse, night duty is different from any other shift. There is something disturbing about starting work at 10 p.m. when most people are settling down for the night. Even the ward is different. With no daytime bustle, only the evening staff eager to go home. The lights are dim and the voices hushed. The patients too have lost their personality that distinguishes them during the day. If you believe in ghosts, it won't seem strange to you that they haunt hospitals because, let's face it, hospitals are places where a lot of people die." This is Mary. "I heard the following stories while a student nurse at the Royal Brisbane Hospital. I don't intend to comment on the truth or otherwise, merely to relate them. Mary tells of her time in Ward 15 and describes its ghost as mischievous. He or she rang buzzers in unoccupied beds and toilets, left locked doors hanging wide open. Once when she was on night duty, a buzzer rang in the female toilets and no patients were missing from their beds, yet the buzzer light glowed red. There was only one way to the loo, and that was past her. Since after a sister had been checked, all the doors were locked, Mary found one swinging open. Ward 4B was the hospital's neurological ward. Neurology operations were performed in a theatre separated from the ward by doors with frosted glass. The theatre was used during the day only, but the story goes that one of the theatre sisters was violently murdered some years ago, but her spirit still haunts her old working place. On several occasions, night staff in the ward had seen a shadowy figure through the frosted glass. She was recognised by the staff by the stiff triangular veil that the sisters of her day wore. She moved slowly and purposefully about the empty theatre as though assisting at an operation. No one ever dared open the locked doors to confront the shadowy figure. During another night duty stint, Mary was working in Ward 8D, the cancer ward. She was caring for patients in room 16. The adjoining room 15, was empty. She suddenly sensed a presence. Something seemed to draw her towards the empty room across the hall. It was empty, it was dark, but that didn't bother her. What did was the sensation of a malignant and suffocating presence. Later, one of the day staff told Mary that she'd been making a bed in room 15 one morning and felt someone tugging at her dress from behind. So I suspect that ghost may have been a male. Mary concluded her article, "It seems that at night, when most human spirits are resting, we are subtly nearer another dimension of life, but we will never know for sure." Enough of ghosts, but if any of you've got any stories, I'd love to hear them. My first legend is one of my heroes of the Royal, Ernest Stanford Jackson, who was obviously an outstanding man. A generation after his death, Professor Neville Sutton wrote, "He was a sound and resourceful surgeon because of his skill and experience, and was acclaimed by his peers as an exceptional exponent of his craft." What a wonderful way to describe him. He came to Brisbane in 1882 as assistant house surgeon after working for only 6 months at the Melbourne Hospital as an RMO following his graduation. Although he was 21, he only looked 18. During his time at the Melbourne, he was called to give evidence in the coroner's court. A juryman questioned his age and the judge said, "Well, you better check his mouth." John Thompson had at that time been house surgeon at the Brisbane Hospital for 6 years and resigned. The chairman of the hospital committee, John Petrie, advertised for a replacement and an assistant. The senior man was to receive £500 a year and the junior £250 a year and accommodation. The committee chose Dr. Jackson as the junior and Leighton Kesteven, an English graduate of 9 years, standing to fill the senior position. Almost immediately after taking up duties, Dr. Kesteven was in trouble with both the hospital committee and the visiting surgeon Joseph Bancroft, Kevin O'Doherty, John Thompson and Kearsley Cannon. Although the house surgeon was provided with a resident, he was expected to provide all of his own furniture. 2 months after appointment, the committee dealt with an allegation that Kesteven used the hospital beds and bedding and was helping himself, guess what, to the spirits in the hospital dispensary. It's a wonder there were any left after our previous people. The surgeons demanded an inquiry into Kesteven's behaviour. They also claimed he would ask them for consultation on seriously ill patients and not turn up. He didn't consult with the visiting staff before initiating his own treatment. This disrespect on the part of a newcomer was a blow to their dignity. This dispute was fully aired in the Courier Mail, who published several editorials questioning the relationship between staff members. They pointed out that Dr. Kesteven might be both exceptionally skilled and kind to his patients, but he lacked tact, direction, and administrative ability, which is a requisite in a man placed as head of such an establishment. Another paper, the Queensland Figaro, claimed the stilted etiquette of visiting staff was opposed to the masterfulness and of the self-confidence paid resident surgeon that the visiting staff, this is all male ego, isn't it? I think. The resident surgeon he expected them to kowtow to him. Poor young, inexperienced Dr. Jackson was caught up in this dispute when the committee asked Kesteven to hand over the charge of the hospital to him. So on the 9th of April 1883, the visiting staff agreed to his appointment as house surgeon, a 21-year-old who looks 18. In 1883, there were 1,642 inpatient admissions with a daily bed occupancy of 132. Jackson's duties, in addition to being involved with patient care, included attending the fortnightly meetings of the committee, hiring and firing. He could dismiss anyone except the matron and the RMOs. At this time, the nursing staff was completely untrained. The doctors were the only ones who were allowed to carry a thermometer. Soon after his appointment, Dr. Jackson visited the fever ward, but could find no nurses. They were all at lunch. He was horrified to discover there was no roster system to allow them to go to meals in shifts. He immediately set out to inculcate the nurses with a sense of responsibility to their patients. He insisted that at least one nurse remain on each ward at all times. And he also disciplined the night staff who slept on duty. And if that wasn't enough, he also clashed with the nurses over the length of their uniforms. On his arrival, the nurses swept the floors of the wards, trailing the dust and no doubt spreading infection with their skirts. He decreed that no nurse should wear a uniform that did this. The nurses rebelled over both of these issues, particularly over having to show so much leg, and threatened to strike or leave. When nurses left the hospital, there was no body of women in the community from which to draw suitable replacements, however. He won the day over the skirts only when the matron herself appeared without the long train on her skirt. To draw replacements, Dr. Jackson went to the immigration department to recruit women arriving on immigrant ships. The matron's duties were related more to housekeeping than to nursing. In 1885, at Dr. Jackson's urging, a position of head nurse was created, and Miss Elizabeth Whedon, who trained at Charing Cross Hospital in London, arrived to fill the post. With her help, he instituted the first nurses' training in Queensland in 1886. I found the following list of rules for nurses that had been written in 1887, but I've got no record of who wrote them, and I do wonder if our legend had a say in it. 1. Daily sweep and mop the floor of your ward. Dust the patient's furniture and windowsills. 2. Maintain an even temperature in your ward by bringing in a scuttle of coal for the day's business. 3. Light is important to observe the patient's condition. Therefore, each day, fill the kerosene lamps, trim their wicks, clean the chimneys, wash the windows once a week. 4. The nurse's notes are important in aiding the physician's work. To make your pens to write carefully, you may whittle the nibs to your individual tastes. 5. Each day, duty nurse will report at 7 a.m. and leave at 8 p.m, except on the Sabbath, on which you will be off from 12 till 2. Graduate nurses in good standing with the matron will be given an evening off each week for courting purposes, and 2 evenings a week if you go regularly to church. 7, each nurse should lay aside from each pay a goodly sum of her earnings for her benefits during her declining years, so she will not become a burden. 8, any nurse who smokes, uses liquor in any form, gets her hair done in a beauty shop, and frequents dance halls will give matron good reason to suspect her worth, intentions, and integrity. 9, the nurse who performs her labours and serves her patients and doctors faithfully for a period of 3 years will be given an increase by hospital administration of 5p a day, providing there are no hospital debts that are outstanding. True, we had to pay for thermometers if we broke one. At this time, nurses lived out, which must have been very difficult in the days before good public transport. Dr. Jackson asked for funds to be made available to build a house in the grounds for nurses. A competition for the design was won by John Hall with Robin Dodds as the architect, and the Lady Lamington Home for Nurses opened in 1897. Dr. Jackson's daughter presented Lady Lamington with her bouquet. During the dispute with Kesteven in 1882, Kevin O'Doherty resigned and another legend, Charles Marks, took his place. In 1885, Dr. Jackson was given assistance in caring for his typhoid patients by Francis Hare, who became a controversial legend with his typhoid baths. In 1886, Dr. Jackson was renamed medical superintendent. 1890 saw another famous family entering our domain in the shape of a visiting bacteriologist, Eugene Hirschfeld. The hospital committee approved the princely sum of £35 to equip his laboratory. He held this role until 1897, when he became an honorary physician. Miss Whedon left the hospital in 1890 to open St Clair's Private Hospital in Dunstan Street in Fortitude Valley, and for the next 3 years, Elizabeth Cross carried out the duties of head nurse. A second RMO was appointed when James Main joined the staff. Our list of legends is growing. The predominant feature of the illnesses treated at the Brisbane Hospital during Jackson's time was the proportion of admissions due to infectious diseases, with typhoid fever and tuberculosis being the chief offenders. During the disastrous year of 1884, when Jackson had no full-time medical assistants, 750 of the 1,900 admissions were due to typhoid or other diseases. In that year, typhoid was responsible for 91 deaths and TB for 40 out of a total of 241 recorded. Other epidemics produced a heavy workload for staff. Scarlet fever forced the temporary use of a quarantine tent hospital in Victoria Park in 1890 and 1898. 2 conditions which added to the workload were venereal disease and intemperance. In addition to women in the Lock Hospital, for which the committee staffed that reluctantly, but they accepted responsibility. There were at times 100 patients suffering from VD admitted during a year. With no suitable accommodation for alcoholics, the hospital was forced to act as a haven for these patients. Another of Jackson's problems was what to do with patients who needed long-term nursing care. Eventually, these patients were sent to the Benevolent Home at Dunwich, and later to the Sandgate Convalescent Hospital, which became Eventide, which is now Metro North Brighton campus. Dr. Jackson believed that the defective closets, which we call loos, were responsible for nurses getting typhoid. And in 1886, he convinced the committee that earth closets should be installed. One of the innovators of these modern loos was one Thomas Crapper. Yes, that's where the name came from. It was brought back from World War I by our diggers. So they were installed at a cost of £7,000. In the 1887-88 budget, he submitted a list of wants: a new outpatient department, a new operating theatre, a new laundry with steam supply also to be ducted to the kitchen, hot water supply, apartments for male and female staff, and a refractory ward. He must have been very persuasive because he first got his theatre, then a new outpatient building facing Hurston Road, which contained a casualty department, a dispensary, and sleeping quarters for the RMOs on the top floor. Unfortunately, the difficult economic situation in the late 1890s brought the hospital to a standstill. A personal dispute started between William Byrne, who was an honorary physician, and Joseph Little, who was at that time president of the Medical Society. They wrote to the committee demanding that VMOs and not Dr. Jackson have charge of his patients. Jackson obviously disagreed in his role as medical superintendent. In November of 1891, the visiting staff asked for a ruling, and the committee decreed that the visiting staff should consult and advise the resident staff regarding the treatment of the patients, and the RMOs carry out treatment as ordered. The committee added, the medical superintendent is responsible for the discipline of the whole establishment. It was customary for the committee to appoint visiting staff, but they then decided to advertise, and the troublemakers Byrne and Little weren't appointed. But owing to objections to the decision, a meeting was held in the Brisbane Town Hall in June of 1892, which was attended by 250 people, including politicians and medicos. Nothing was resolved. A new scheme of management for the hospital proposed by 29 practitioners was published in the Courier Mail. Following the meeting, some of our legends were involved in this proposal: Joseph Bancroft, John Thompson, Lillian Cooper, Jeffries Turner. The proposal provided that the medical superintendent be appointed for 2 years only and be promoted from RMO staff on approval from the hospital committee and from visiting staff. This difference of opinion went on and on. It was a power struggle with the control of the hospital as its prize. The committee supported Dr. Jackson. He was rewarded by being given permission to carry his private practice within 5 miles of the hospital. When he gave notice of his resignation on the 17th of August, 1898, he announced his intention to practice in Wickham Terrace. The committee acknowledged his service thus: the committee places on record their high appreciation of the services rendered by Jackson, first as assistant resident surgeon and afterwards for 15 years as medical superintendent. They are confident that the high repute enjoyed by the institution is largely due to the untiring assiduity of Dr. Jackson and the excellent discipline of the whole staff, to a greater extent to his judicial government. They cordially thanked Dr. Jackson for his hearty cooperation with them during all the years aforenamed, and wished him in private practice to which he had devoted himself all the success he can himself desire. After leaving the Brisbane Hospital, he went on to lead a distinguished life, which included purchasing St Helens Hospital, which became the Wesley, moved a motion to establish a medical school in Brisbane, served in Egypt with number 2 AGH. He led a deputation to the Queensland Government for the establishment of a medical research institute in Brisbane. He was president of BMA Queensland 3 times, to name just a few. He retired in 1934 and died on the 29th of June 1938. A true legend. Professor Douglas Gordon wrote, "Jackson lived his life at a period when the medical profession was taking advantage of a flood tide. Most successful careers have an element of luck. In Jackson's case, it was just being born when the time was right." Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanette. That was fascinating. Some myths and some legends and a fair bit of alcohol in there. And Ernst Sanford Jackson is certainly one of my heroes. And in addition to all the achievements you mentioned, he was one of the founding fathers of the College of Royal Australasian College of Surgeons, the only Queenslander amongst the half dozen who did that, and probably the first real properly trained surgeon in the state. So, all right, now look, it's my pleasure now to introduce my co-chair, Dr. Lloyd Toft, and Lloyd's had a very long association with this hospital, with this establishment as well. He was an accomplished orthopaedic surgeon, and in his early days he trained with one of the most famous orthopaedic surgeons of the day, and even now, John Charnley, who introduced the total hip prosthesis, the Charnley hip prosthesis. Lloyd came back to this campus as what would now be regarded as the Director of Orthopaedic Surgery, and subsequent to that he joined the visiting staff and was a BMO in orthopaedic surgery for many years, specialising in arthroplasty, and Lloyd was really responsible for the introduction of the clean air, sterile operating theatre environment, so important in avoiding infection in joint replacement. He later had a distinguished career as the chairman of the Medical Board of Queensland, so it's my pleasure to ask Lloyd to come forward, and he will introduce our next guest, Emeritus Professor Ken Donald, who's also very well known to all of us.
Well, good evening. I have an admission to make. This is the first time I have been on this campus since I did my last outpatient clinic at the Royal Children's Hospital in December 2002. So I suppose I should be a little ashamed of that, but anyway. Now I'm to introduce a friend and colleague, Ken Donald. You have his CV, but he's given me a little bit to talk about. Ken's MBBS Queensland, 1962, PhD, FRC-PA, FRC Pathology, that's the English Pathology Fellowship, FRAC-MA, and an honorary FRACS, as well as being AO and the Queensland Great provided in 2002. Now I'll come back to that. I emphasised the fact that he graduated in 1962 because we started medicine together in 1956, but unfortunately Ken dropped back a year. When you read his CV, you'll see that he's quite a bright chap. The reason he dropped back was, of course, he was selected in the Wallabies to play in the UK in 1956, 7. And so he recommenced medicine and graduated a year after me. But I like telling that story because we had another one started medicine with me, in fact, who also is very well known to most of you as an eminent surgeon, administrator, a fellow called David Thiel. And he started medicine with us in 1956. And he dropped back a year, but he went on to the 1956 Olympics and won the 100 metres gold medal in the 100 metres backstroke. So we had two very distinguished fellows who started medicine with us, but didn't quite get through in the usual 6 years. I've got a little bit of Ken's CV, which he kindly gave to me. He began specialising in pathology and became a registrar at what we then was the Brisbane General Hospital, but I'll continue to call it the Royal Brisbane because I can't remember when it became the Royal. He became a senior lecturer in pathology in 68, 72, a WHO fellow. He got a WHO fellowship 72 to 74, doing his PhD in Rotterdam and Edinburgh. He then became Director of Pathology at the Royal, 76 to 80. Deputy Director General, Queensland Health, 81 to 88. So he's gone into administration from clinical work. He went to Newcastle as Professor of Pathology and Director of Pathology. Then from 1992 to 99, he was Professor of Social and Preventive Medicine, University of Queensland. 99 to 2006, Head of School of the Medical School at the UQ, and subsequently he's still a Professor at the School of Medicine at Griffith University. So with that introduction, may I introduce my friend and colleague and golfing colleague, Ken Donald.
Thank you, Lloyd, for that fairly censored version of our history. I'm not a historian. I'm an old man with a fading memory and opinions which you may find you don't have to take any notice of. I'm here because I told Cliff a couple of stories at another function and he put me on the agenda. So I guess my role is to tell some stories, which I will try to do. I'm not quite sure where this is going, by the way. I've got a couple of notes. Actually, Sanford died in 1938, and that's the period when I want to start talking about the stories I remember. Because I'm going to just talk about three things. I'm going to talk about some context around a couple of stories about Peter Rosa, or Wilhelm Hans Peter Rosa, John Tyrer, and a few other characters that I knew over the years. But I want to put that in a bit of context so that some of the things that those people did, like the thing on the wall says that John Tyrer was the father of research. Now, there's a much more complicated story behind that, which I have an opinion about, which I'll share with you. I want to start before penicillin. I can remember having scarlet fever before penicillin was invented. The treatment was to put me to bed rest permanently for 2 weeks. I wasn't allowed out of bed. I was in an isolation ward at the back of the Ipswich General Hospital. My parents were able to get within 50 metres and I was in total isolation. There was a school sports meeting on the day I got out, so I told I could get out. I jumped out of bed and tried to run to see if I could run for the school. I fell flat on my face. So bed rest is not good for you. Now, we know that now, but that was the only treatment available for streptococcal infection followed by scarlet fever. I have another story about penicillin which concerns Barry Hickey, who was a cohort of mine. He was in our year. Barry graduated with us. Barry became a senior respiratory physician. About the same year I was locked up with my scarlet fever, Barry developed lobar pneumonia. He was in the Mater Hospital. And the clinicians told his father that he would have a crisis in the next 48 hours. He had a 50-50 chance of surviving the crisis, but he had a 50-50 chance of dying. But if he survived the crisis, he would be all right. So Barry's father said, "There's nothing you can do about it." And the clinicians at the Mater said, "There's this wonderful new drug called penicillin. It would fix this overnight. But the only penicillin available in Australia is with the American Armed Forces at Eagle Farm Airport." Now, going back to the alcohol story that we've just heard, alcohol becomes very important here because Barry's father owned 2 hotels in Brisbane. And you can guess the rest of the story. He went home, he loaded a truck with alcohol from his hotel, drove to Eagle Farm Airport, drove up to the gate and met the sentry. To cut a long story short, Barry got the penicillin and he's here today. So those were the sorts of things that were happening just about the time when Sanford died. That's where we were in medical practice. On the way in, I stopped in Block 7 and looked at the list of things that happen in the hospital now by the ward, by the lift, and I'm astonished. I find myself leading a curriculum review at Griffith Medical School. And to go, in one lifetime, to go from no penicillin to what's going to happen with artificial intelligence, machine learning and deep neural networks in medical education in the next 10 years, it's just boggling my mind what's left of it. From there, when we started, you may remember this, Lloyd, medical students now, when they come here to this hospital, are well, truly looked after and oriented. When we started in medicine, I remember a physics lecturer saying to us, "Welcome to the University of Queensland. You're in first year medicine and there are 330 of you. Next year, there will be 105 in second year. Look at the people on either side of you and 2 of you won't be here next year." I remember that lecturer as if it happened yesterday. He was our physics lecturer. And indeed, at the end of the year, 225 failed and 105 progressed to second year. If that happened now, they would sack the Vice-Chancellor. I would. Those are the sorts of things that were happening around that time. I became an intern at this hospital and I became terrified of Aubrey Pye. Aubrey was the medical superintendent. Now, Aubrey, as it turns out, was a lovely guy. I was terrified of him because almost every interaction I had with Aubrey would now be defined as bullying. Okay? I was absolutely terrified of him. At the end of first year, to my astonishment, he wrote to my mother and he said, "Your boy is doing well in my hospital. I think he will do well in the future." So now, no superintendent would do that now, but Aubrey Pye did that. I came to realise the reason he was bullying me was in the interest of patient safety. He was making sure that I performed properly to the standards of the day. So I went from being scared of the fellow to being one of my heroes. My mother still has, well, my mother's dead, but the letter's still in her papers. So moving on, before we get to Tyra and Rosa, I've got some notes here. At the end of second year, in the first week of second year as a resident, I was sent to Nambour. I got to Nambour with 2 little kids. The house was filthy. My wife took 2 days to clean the house we were due to live in. And I found I was the only doctor at Nambour Hospital. Everybody else had gone on holidays. So I complained, and for the next 2 months, they rotated interns who were 1 year behind me to be my staff, one at a time. And I saw a thing by the ward, by the lift tonight coming in, critical incident support unit. On my 3rd morning, I ran into the first anemia in pregnancy in the casualty department. I walked down, the floor was covered in blood, there's a woman dying on the floor. What do we do? I didn't know what to do. I rang up Eric Shaw in the blood bank and he said she needs fresh whole blood. I said, "Send some." He said, "It'll take 3 hours to get there. She'll be dead." So we called in some donors, we bled the donors, put the blood straight into the patient directly from the donors. She did survive, goodness knows how. Talk about critical incidents and talk about, support for them. It just wasn't even thought of in those times. So this is the picture when Tyra was appointed as Professor of Medicine. Tyra was born in 1920. Peter Rosa, Hans Peter Wilhelm Rosa, by the way, Hans Peter Wilhelm Rosa, was born in 1939 in Germany, and I was born in 1936 in Ipswich, Queensland. Now, when Tyra was appointed, he was a cardiologist. He made some inquiries and discovered that there was no neurologist in Brisbane. So before he took up the appointment, he spent a year in London learning to be a neurologist. So he's never properly trained as a neurologist. He's just did a year of neurology before he came here, so that there was a neurologist on the staff. And when you talk, in my 6-year long case, to pass and be graduated, my long case examiners were John Tyra and Martin Lloyd. And things were not, I took the history, did the examination, made up a few ideas about what treatments might be available, and confronted these two gentlemen. After I'd been going for about 3 or 4 minutes, I saw Martin Lloyd look at John Tyra. They sort of nodded, and Martin Lloyd said, put his hand up and stopped me. He said, "Mr. Donald, I think you should start again." Now, I've never been sure to this day how far off track I was or whether they were just having fun. Because, and I have a strong suspicion it was they were just having fun. Anyway, so I finally passed and left them. Just going fast forward a little bit, some years later, when I'm now head of the School of Medicine, and John Tyra is seeking permission to do some historical studies in the medical school in the museum, it was an interesting inversion of the long case situation. So I didn't have fun, but I did approve the application. But I met John many times in that circumstance. And here it was, I was then approaching 70. He was then approaching, I was late 60s, he was early 80s. He was 16 years older than me. And we were just two old guys talking in the corridor. He was a nice gentleman, good sense of humour, interested in people, but as a student we were all terrified of him. I ran into Mel Parker the other day at the Emeritus Professor's Lunch, and Mel was reminiscing about how scared of John Tyra he was. I also ran into Martin Lloyd when I was head of the Department of Social and Preventive Medicine and had an argument with Martin about the epidemiology of some treatment he was doing in endocrinology, which was, again, a very strange relationship many years later from something that started as a student and teacher relationship. So these things mature over time and you begin to understand the real people around you, not just the impressions you have as a young person. Moving on, as Director of Pathology, I want to just set the scene for what research was like when John Tyra arrived. When I became Director of Pathology, in the Path Lab I discovered that there were quite a few things that the staff had done which could have been the subject of copyright, could have been the subject of further research. And I approached Queensland Health at the day, I'm talking now mid-70s, to promote this. And I got thoroughly warned that that was not my job. If I went along that sort of stuff, I mightn't last very long. So there was, although Queensland had the QIMR, which had been set up to do research, which was funded by the government, there was no perception in those 60s in Queensland Health or in health departments in many, many parts of the world that research was important to patient care on the ground. The thing that Tyra brought, I think, that changed more than the fact of doing research, was he brought the perception that a hospital that does research provides better patient care as a consequence of the attitudes of the staff. I think that was what Tyra had, that he brought, that made the difference. He wasn't the best researcher in the country. I don't think he was even the best researcher in his department. He certainly was the best strategic planner in his department, and he engendered enormous loyalty in his staff because they trusted him. So in other words, his contribution to the way in which clinical research has developed in this hospital was more about his relationship with the staff around him and his understanding that good patient care depends upon people who are thinking about research at the time. Doesn't matter whether the research is important to that patient, it's the attitude that improves the patient standards in the whole hospital. And I thought in those days that's what Tyra brought to the show. One story I will tell you as Director of Pathology, it concerns the internal medicine laboratories. One morning in my office when I was Director of Paths, Robin Mortimer turned up and he said, "I've got to talk to you." And I said, "Oh, yeah." And he and Michael Ward and Peter Craswell and Bill Davies had just arrived, either just come from England or arrived back from the United States where they'd finished their training, where they'd been accustomed to medical units having research labs attached to the medical units. And they'd put a proposal to the board that the Department of Medicine in the hospital, not the university, should have research labs attached to the hospitals. And they were knocked back. So Robin came to see me and said, "Can you fly under the radar and we'll set these up pretending they're Department of Pathology labs?" And I said, "Well, sure, that sounds like a very good idea to me." So we wrote all these submissions and we got these labs through the board. They were under the old Edmund Tooth Lecture Theatre. There was an area renovated under there to put these labs in. We got approval, we got them through, and I pretended as Director of Pathology that we were going to do these various things in the labs. Please don't tell the board if there are any surviving members. Anyway, they had an opening for these laboratories and Brian Austin, the Health Minister, came to the opening. Now, it's an old man's opinion, but I held the view that one of the major contributions to the way research is now done in this system was Brian Austin as Minister. He was one of the best health ministers I worked for, and he was one who made long-term plans. He understood long-term plans. He understood that these things needed to be done. And I have a little story. At the opening of those labs, Austin was there and he played rugby league as a front row forward for Brisbane in the Bulimba Cup, they called it in those days. So during the afternoon tea to open these laboratories, Brian Austin sort of pulled me aside and he said something like, "It's not bad for a boneheaded old wallaby to be heading up a pathology department like this. How did you get here?" And I said, "Well, I'm doing better than a rugby league forward would." So we established a reasonable rapport. And then he said to me, "These are research labs, aren't they?" And I looked at him and I said, "Yes, Minister, they are research labs." And he said, "Does the board know?" I said, "Well, we haven't really told them that, sir." He said, "Fine, yeah, well, okay, sir." So anyway, I went back to my office. At about 2:30 in the afternoon, the phone rang and my secretary said, "It's Minister Austin on the phone." I picked up the phone and he said, "Look," he said, "would you like to come into the health department? And we need a Deputy Director General. I think you would be it." So I said, yes. I went up home and asked my wife. I said, "What do you think? This is going to be moving from clinical work to admin," which Lloyd said I did. And so she said, "Well, that sounds like a good idea." So I accepted the offer and moved into the health department on the basis of that conversation with Brian. And I might say I wasn't, they thought I was probably a National Party member and that I was a political appointment. I'd never been a member of any political party. It wasn't a political appointment. He wanted somebody in there who would make some long-term attempts to promote research in the system. And it still wasn't widely promoted. The reason was that the government felt that funding of QIMR was its contribution to research, and that was excellent. QIMR was a great place and still is, and the people that thought it set it up had great insight. But the government of any persuasion could never see that embedding research in the hospital system would improve patient care, as well as maybe improve the knowledge base for the practice of medicine. And that was preserved by the structure of the health department in those days, where the money was looked after by the Under-Secretary and the Director General of Health looked after only the medical quality, really, but had no say in the allocation of resources. And the Under-Secretaries, it's not their fault, the Under-Secretaries were bound by Treasury to budget deadlines, which were absolute for them. So it was the system that was stopping research from developing in a hospital like this at the clinical level. And that's what Tyra broke. That's what Tyra broke, with strategic thinking, careful planning, and sometimes, for example, I was talking to one of his colleagues just a couple of days ago, and it reminded me that when Eric Saint became dean, Eric decided he would have a good look at what was going on in the departments. So he set out a thing saying he wanted feedback from the departments on a regular basis, for the university departments in the hospital, about what they were doing day to day, so that he could understand. Now, John Tyra was not too keen on authority, so he was suspicious of this. So he asked his secretary to send to the dean's office every piece of paper that came across the whole department for the rest of all the time. After 3 weeks, Eric Saint gave up and said, "Don't send any more." That was fairly, to me, that was fairly classical Tyra. Like, it was a bit of fun, but it was also very effective strategically. Now, coming to Wilhelm Hans Peter Rosa. Peter was in my year. We graduated together. We became firm friends. We played golf together. We travelled the world together. I gave the eulogy at his funeral. So Peter and I were pretty close friends. Now, he was born in 1939 in Germany. He came to Brisbane, I'm not sure exactly what year he arrived, but he came to Brisbane Grammar School not speaking English. I think it was junior year, so that means he was at Brisbane Grammar for 3 years. He was in the top 3 in the senior in the state, and he won the English prize at Brisbane Grammar School. Peter was one of the highest intelligence people I have ever met, good at languages, which will come back in a moment. When he was a junior, he became a junior doctor. I think it was his second year. He was appointed to the University Department of Medicine and met Tyra, having met Tyra as a student. And then on a ward round, I don't know whether too many have ever heard this story, but I can vouch for it. One of the great stories of the hospital, I think. You know how the rounds used to go when, there was 5 or 6 levels of doctors and then a bunch of students and several nurses and a whole lot of people, sort of a crowd moving from bed to bed. And John Tyra was doing his usual performance, a great performer, Tyra, great performer, and also a Francophile. It's well known that Tyra was obsessed by the French. He thought the French were absolutely astonishing. He went to France many times. Anyway, there was a French sailor in one of his beds who had been in for a while. So Tyra took his history entirely in French. So this conversation went on with this French sailor for about 15 minutes in French. And Rosa was the medical officer, whose case it was. And so Tyra turned to Rosa at the end of this exposition and said to him, "Dr. Rosa, have you got that history?" Which was like Tyra's attempt to do those Tyra's things. And Rosa said, "Yes, sir," and read it back to him in German. Now, it is a measure of the two men that Rosa stayed in Tyra's department for the next 35 years. And Peter was, Wilhelm Hans Peter, or Peter, he, like Tyra, was not the best researcher in the department. I think Peter published about 35 or 40 papers, most of them around clinical haematology. But he was instrumental in that department. He was the clinician's clinician. He was the consultant's consultant. He was the one that helped translate research into practice. And the students were terrified of him. For the same reason I was terrified of, and I started off being terrified of John Tyra. It was all about the patients. If the students weren't doing well with the patients, the students knew about it. It was the patients that came first, which was what drove those men and what made them fearsome for us until we understood why they were taking that hard line with us. So Peter worked there for many, many years, and he and Tyra, of course, he became one of Tyra's loyal workers. Tyra engendered in him the same loyalty he engendered in a lot of the rest of his staff. They worked many, many years firmly together after what was a very interesting morning ward round. Thank you very much.
Well, wasn't that great? Eh? But if you've got a whole evening, we've got a lot more stories that we can tell from the old days, the residence quarters, Lanoma, you name it. But I think we'll press on with the agenda. So it's now my pleasure to reintroduce Jeanette Wiley, whose subject is the Wickham Terrace Massacre. And we were just talking before the evening started, because I remember that was in December 1955, and I must have just done senior examination, I don't know, but I do remember all the news in the newspaper about the terrible business that went on Wickham Terrace. But I have a personal note to say, because, and I'm not taking away from Jeanette's story, but Michael Gallagher, who was, well, this is orthopaedic surgeons. Michael Gallagher was an orthopaedic surgeon, badly wounded. So his brother, John Gallagher, who was doing his postgraduate training in England, came back to take over Michael's practice. And there were two orthopaedic surgeons in Barrow Chambers who were killed, and Don Tuffley, who was then wanted to be or trained as an orthopaedic surgeon, but he was the surgical superintendent in, I think, Toowoomba Hospital, and he came back to take over one of those practices in Barrow Chambers. And by coincidence, of course, I was a registrar to both John Gallagher and Don Tuffley, and then I became a colleague and a friend. So it's perhaps a small world in one way. But anyway, Jeanette, you're coming to tell the story.
Sorry, hang on. Sorry, just start here. Should start there. I don't know why it's. Modern technology is wonderful when it works, isn't it? So I'll just go that. Review and slideshow. There we go. Then you just press it. Sorry. Thanks, Lloyd. A tragic legend is the story of what happened on Wickham Terrace on the 1st of December 1955. On that day, Siegfried Karl Karst went on a murderous rampage against the most prominent orthopaedic surgeons in Brisbane. He killed two, he almost killed a third, and there were others injured both physically and psychologically. Karst was a German national who had jumped ship in Brisbane from a freighter in July of 1939, just before the commencement of World War II. His arrival was noted, but he wasn't apprehended until war was declared, when he was interned as an enemy alien. He claimed that he had fled from Nazi persecution, but Queensland authorities suspected he was a German spy. Jumping ship was common with spies. He vowed he was anti-Nazi. He expressed a strong dislike to become a strong desire to become a citizen of his newly appointed nation. His internment in the company of Nazi Germans was troubled and turbulent and in conflict with both captors and captives. He fitted no mould and made several escape attempts, some of which were temporarily successful. He went into a forced labour camp after internment. He had flat feet, which was presumably previously asymptomatic. He then complained of pain, but no one would believe him. Arrested as a maritime deserter, he was given his freedom when prosecutors offered no evidence against him in court. Cast promptly went to Ayr to work in a sugar mill. He was working there when Australia declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939. 23 days into World War II, Cast was rearrested in Ayr and sent to Gaythorne prison camp in Brisbane. On his very first day of internment, he lodged an appeal, pages of his life story. However, it failed. Cast wasn't going to accept this, so he made his first escape on the 29th of December. It was carefully planned, but he was captured and transferred to a much tougher camp in Victoria, from which his escape attempts continued until 1943. Over the years, he constantly complained of pain. He became an Australian citizen in 1950. He worked on the Tully Falls dams, where he became familiar with explosives and consistently visited doctors complaining of headaches, painful feet. No diagnosis was forthcoming. In May of 1954, he injured his back. In August, he slipped and was placed on compensation. After returning to work, he continued to complain of pain, and following numerous x-rays and investigations, no reason could be found by numerous doctors. He became very annoyed. He came to England in mid-1955, presented himself to 7 more doctors, none of whom could find any cause for the pains he claimed he suffered. Throughout his fruitless progress from surgery to surgery, he maintained his rage and his paranoid belief that the medical profession had closed ranks to deny him justice. He carefully prepared 30 kilograms of bombs and obtained a .38 calibre pistol. Subsequent investigations confirmed the location of the bomb-making equipment and uncovered a farewell note. Before leaving Cairns some months previously, Cast had obtained the necessary materials for his plans and had told the residents of Cairns that he intended to blow up the Cairns branch of the Government Insurance Office. I think that was probably because his compensation claim had been denied. He also made comments forecasting his possible demise. On Thursday, the 1st of December 1955, he went to Wickham Terrace. The load of bombs were too heavy to carry on such a hot day, so he travelled by taxi. He went first to the office of Dr. Michael Gallagher in Wickham House. Dr. Michael Gallagher was 35 and came from Mackay, graduated from Queensland University in 1947. He worked his way to England as ship's surgeon on a coal-fired freighter to undertake his orthopaedic degree in Liverpool. On his return to Brisbane, he worked at the Mater Hospital. His testimony offers an insight into what happened that fateful day. Quote, "Shortly before 3 p.m. on Thursday the 1st of December, I was examining a patient in my examination room. I was standing at the end of the couch examining her foot on which I had recently operated. In the room at the time was the girl's mother and my relieving assistant, Mrs. Joan Morahan. A door leads from my office into the examination room, and I looked up and saw a man whom I did not recognise standing in the room. I was about to speak to him, to tell him to wait outside, when I noticed a revolver in his hand and he fired. This bullet struck me in my right forearm. A second shot was then fired, which entered the right side of my chest. As a result of that, I gradually fell to the floor of the surgery, supporting myself on a table as I fell. Whilst I was on the floor, he walked around to where my feet were and fired another shot, standing at my feet. This bullet struck me in the right leg. After he fired the first shot, I didn't recognise the man and asked him what was the meaning of this. And I thought he replied, "It's to do with spies." But after subsequent thought, I think he replied, it's to do with spine. Dr. Gallagher survived. In the foyer of Wickham House, Cast left a bomb wrapped in brown paper and lit it. George Boland, a horse trainer, had been visiting another doctor in the building, and his testimony was, after being examined, I left his surgery and walked down the stairs to the first floor. When I reached the hallway leading out onto Wickham Terrace, I walked into the foyer and saw a sister and heard her say, "We will all be burnt to death." I noticed a brown paper parcel burning at one end. There was nobody else there. I proceeded to walk out of the building, but on getting halfway out, I decided to go back and put the fire out, which looked very simple. I walked back and put my foot on the lighted end of the parcel about 6 times, but couldn't extinguish the flame. I then picked up the parcel and noticed a stone flower vase in the centre of the foyer, and I was going to put it in that because it had sand in it. When I picked the parcel up, I became very sceptical of it, owing to its weight. It was 7 or 8 pounds. On turning it upside down to put it out and bumping it 2 or 3 times on the bottom of the vase, a round thing slipped out of the brown paper. I then noticed what appeared to be a piece of lead piping of conduit about 15 inches long and 3 inches round. There was a candle protruding out of it and a bandage beside it saturated with fluid. I broke the candle off and put my hand over the end of it, trying to extinguish the fire. I realised it was a homemade bomb. I held it in my left hand and was going to throw it out into the street. I'd only taken 1 step and it exploded. There was a terrible crash and a blinding light, and my left eye was closed and my right one almost closed. My hand was blown above my head. Miraculously, George lost 2 fingers but didn't lose his sight. When Cast left Wickham House, he walked 100 metres to Ballow Chambers and went directly to the first floor office of John Lars, who had seen him as a patient the previous day. He placed his satchel of remaining bombs by the chair in the waiting room and went back down the stairs to the ground floor office of Dr. Paddy Meehan. Dr. Arthur Vincent Meehan, known as Paddy, was born in Sydney and studied medicine at Sydney University, graduating in 1914. He served in World War I. He supervised the amputation of his own foot and lower leg following an injury at Passchendaele in Belgium. He commanded the Rosemount Military Hospital as the first fully qualified orthopaedic specialist in Queensland. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh in 1918 and became a Fellow of the Royal Australian College of Surgeons. He worked at both the Brisbane General and Children's Hospital and was orthopaedic surgeon to the Greenslopes Military Hospital during World War II. He was regarded as a doyen of orthopaedic surgeons in Queensland. Dr. Meehan was in his consulting room discussing a forthcoming operation with the parents of a teenage girl. He was standing examining an X-ray when Cast walked through the door, levelled the pistol at him and fired 1 shot. As Cast's bullet struck him, the doctor clutched his abdomen and fell to the floor, dying almost immediately from a wound in his heart. As screams from the secretary, Annie Walsh, rang out through the building, Cast went to another suite, that of Dr. Andrew Russell Murray, aged 45. Murray was born in Tasmania. He studied medicine at Melbourne University in 1936, became a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh in 1943. He returned and worked at the Brisbane Hospital as an orthopaedic surgeon. He specialised in the new and delicate techniques then emerging for hand surgery and also controlled the hospital's emergency organisation. In his rooms, Murray was examining a patient named John Cameron from Point Vernon in Hervey Bay. Cameron heard the door of the examination room open. He saw Cast run into the room and shout, "Doctor, there's been an accident." As the doctor turned to face him, Cast fired a shot from his revolver. Dr. Murray clutched his abdomen and sank to the floor. The gunman ran back through the door as his victim died, his aorta severed by the bullet. However, Cast had not yet completed his mission of revenge. He returned to the waiting room to collect his satchel of destruction, intent on killing one more doctor. Dr. John Randolph Sergius Lars gained his medical degree from Sydney University in 1924, became a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh in 1936, a registered orthopaedic specialist in 1941, and a Master of Surgery in Queensland, and a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons in 1947. Still on the rampage, Cast returned upstairs to the office of Lars, where the horror entered its final act in an incredible manner. John Lars told the coroner his secretary, Mrs. Wilson, told him that Dr. Meehan had been murdered. Lars said, "I left my patient and rushed out through the swing doors. As I was going out, Cast met me. He had a gun in his hand that was pointed at my chest and was carrying a brown leather bag in his other hand. He said, 'Get in there.' He told Miss Kelly, his nurse, and Mrs. Wilson to get out. He held the gun and forced me back into my consulting room. My two staff came too. Cast again told them to leave and still held me with the gun to my chest. He forced me into the examination room, and Miss Wilson and Miss Kelly followed me. One of them slammed the door, leaving Cast in one room and us in the other. We tiptoed our way back to the office and out of the building. We went to another building to phone the police, but the number was engaged, so I drove to Roma Street Police Station to report the events, only to be told the police were already on their way. As he left Ballow Chambers, Dr. Lars heard the sound of a shot and an explosion. When he eventually returned to his rooms, he saw that a bomb had exploded. Cast had found himself isolated in the consulting room. He ignited the bomb and shot himself through the head. The bomb exploded, causing major damage. In the meanwhile, the police had arrived and barricaded the door. When it was broken down, they found Cast lying unconscious on the floor among the devastation with the pistol in his hand. There were homemade bombs, still unexploded, one in a malted milk tin containing 5 sticks of gelignite and 30 detonators. It had been lit, but a faulty fuse stopped it from exploding. Cast was placed on a stretcher and taken to the Brisbane General Hospital, where he died that afternoon. Following the shooting, Dr. Gallagher remained in the Mater Hospital for weeks. A bullet was lodged near his kidneys. He was so shocked that no one could tell him his friend Arthur Meehan had died. But 6 months later, he returned to surgery. He held appointments at the Mater and other public hospitals for 57 years. He continued to provide services to Greenslopes until 1987, a private practice until 1994. He then engaged in medico-legal work and assisted with surgical procedures until 2000, aged nearly 80. Medicine was not only a profession to me, it was my life. He died in 2009. Dr. Arthur Meehan's death was a medical disaster for the Mater Hospital. It took many years to find a doctor with his experience and reputation. One of his sons, Kenny, was on the list of successful first-year medical students, published the day after his death. Kenny wrote, "I just hope he knew that I had graduated at last." The sentiment was a reference to Dr. Meehan's own experience. He came from a poor family where all members clubbed together to pay for his medical course. He always regretted that his own father had died shortly before his own graduation. His widow lived for another 25 years, and daughter Patricia said that her mother wore the bullet-holed vest which Dr. Meehan died in because it made her feel closer to him. Dr. Murray's widow carried on with her career as a social worker while bringing up 3 young children. Her mother and brother came from England to help, but both died, so she decided to take her children and return home to England. Dr. Murray's death left a huge gap in the orthopaedic services of the Royal Brisbane Hospital in the late 1950s. I spoke recently with Jean Lars, John's daughter-in-law, who is a very elegant 93-year-old. She told me Dr. Lars was admitted to hospital following the incident, suffering from shock, and was never the same again. Dr. Gallagher wrote in his book, A History of Orthopaedics, at the Mater, although not physically injured by cast, John Lars suffered a profound upset which adversely affected his heart, slowly ailing general health, and possibly contributed to his premature death in 1959. The heroines of the day, Beverly Wilson and Kathleen Kelly, continued to work for him until he died, and then worked for his son, John, who took over his practice. Kathleen died in 1977 and Beverly in 1988. George Boland went on to train many more winners in his Hendra racing stables, including the 1969 Brisbane Cup winner Galleon King. He worked at the track at Eagle Farm the day before he died unexpectedly from a heart attack on the 21st of June 1976, aged 61. Siegfried Karl Karst shares allotment number 33 in the unadorned paupers section of Toowong Cemetery with 4 others. The grave has kept his deepest, darkest secrets for 64 years. In the time that has elapsed since this tragedy, there now appears to be a better understanding of the clinical and emotional state of people injured at work, but there is also a more vigorous and evidence-based approach to causation. This leaves some workers whose incorrect perception that their symptoms, real or imagined, are caused by their occupation, confused and progressively resentful. Their support base often consists of friends at work, a union, or their legal advisors, may be the hidden enemy of rationality. Such reinforcements may include sickness behaviour and the them and us mentality. Legal and illegal medications and recreation drugs and hosts of other modern social factors help set up the stage for possible serious irrational behaviour at their doctor by susceptible individuals. Dr. Neville Parker, a Queensland psychiatrist writing in 1979 about the Wickham Street Massacre, said, "Orthopaedic surgeons are more inclined to express their prejudices without regard for the patient's reaction than other members of the profession, and it is for this reason that they are the subgroup within the profession who are at the greatest risk of patient violence. There is more to emotional disturbance after injury than a mere quest for compensation. Doctors who hold this simple belief may be at risk if they do not carefully handle the rare cases of severe and dangerous mental illnesses which malingerers masquerade." Many current medical legal reports, particularly in relation to workers' compensation claims, adopt a cautious and defensive style of writing. This may be influenced by this regulation, codes of conduct and other legal constraints, but those who were involved in or recall the events of the 1st of December 1955 acknowledge that this tragedy had a profound and understandable effect on the style of medical legal reporting, especially in Queensland. It was 80 years today that World War II was declared, so can we just spend a moment remembering all of the staff from our hospital who served both here and overseas, those who returned and those who didn't. They are the true legends. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jeanette. That was a fascinating, tragic page in our history. which changed the whole face of orthopaedic surgery. And thank you for those wise words and lessons at the end. I do feel some personal attachment to that tragedy, because when I was a junior doctor after my residency here, I went to the United Kingdom to do some further training, and the first job I had there was in Brighton, and I met the senior social worker soon after I arrived, and she came up and asked me if I was from Australia, and I replied in the affirmative, and it turned out that she was Trudy Murray, the wife of Ben Murray, the orthopaedic surgeon who'd been killed by Carl Cast on Wickham Terrace. And as you mentioned, Ben Murray really was the pioneer of hand surgery in Brisbane. One of the first to specialise in that area. So I guess that completes the evening. I'm sure both Jeanette and Ken would be happy to take any questions, or if anyone in the audience has any comments, I would invite them. On a lighter note, I did also identify with Ken's anecdote about John Tyra, and I was unlucky enough to have John examine me in my final year medical long case, and some sort of complex neurological problem, and whilst he was haranguing me with questions, obscure questions, I determined then that I would be pursuing a career in surgery and not in medicine. And then many years later, when John was a very old man, I was lucky enough to have him as a patient. He was referred to me as a patient, and when I saw his name on the list of appointments, I wondered if it was the same John Tyra, and had a peek out into the waiting room, and sure enough, it was unrecognisable as John, although very much older. And I couldn't help but muse upon that sort of old expression that revenge is a dish best served cold. So would you be happy to any questions from the audience?